A classic mile race. Smooth, calculated, yet has that tinge of aggressiveness fans will always appreciate. This race in particular is out at a blistering pace, and there are several men who are adhering to such a harsh tempo. 55:07 through the first quarter? Nice. What about the halfway mark? 151:58? Also nice. At this point, it's become evident that a world record is potentially on its way, and after Morocco's Hicham El Guerrouj comes through the finish line, he clocks in a time that is still unbeaten to this very day. Kenya's Noah Nien also comes through right behind El Guerrouj, running what is still the second fastest time in history too. But what happened to this guy right after the halfway point? Maybe he just gassed out and couldn't handle it. Well then, what about this guy? Also, why are they wearing the same distinct yellow jerseys too? That's because these two men didn't just hop out of the race due to fatigue. Okay, maybe that's part of it. But these two were actually hired by the governing body of track and field to help runners like El Guerrouj break the world record. These athletes are called pacers. Just so no one is confused, there's a key difference between someone simply leading the race for an extended period of time and a pacer or rabbit. A pacer has a preset, designated tempo requested by either an athlete or the event itself. It's basically used to help athletes run extremely fast times or to break some sort of records. Some races will have one pacer, some will have two, and if you get to the longer disciplines like the 10,000 or marathon, you can have upwards to 3 or more separate pacers, helping athletes work towards a specific mark. The first evidence of a race with designated pace setters seems to have occurred in the 1930s on numerous occasions in France. French athlete Jules Ladumeg was documented to have had rabbits for his 1,000, 1,500, and 2,000 meter world records in 1930 and 1931. This was pretty revolutionary for its time, because instead of world records happening through sheer competition or through a solo time trial, it was completely unheard of for athletes to hop into a race for a certain period of time, drop out soon after, and hope the person they're pacing sets the new world record. Outside of Ladumeg, the next notable world record wouldn't happen with pacers until the 1950s. And it's a mark the whole world of track and field is familiar with to this day, and that's of course Roger Bannister's sub-4 mile in 1954. On May 6, 1954, teammates Chris Chataway and Chris Brasher were designated pacers for this race, with Brasher coming through the halfway point in 1:58 and Chataway through the 3/4 mark at 3 flat. While the splits weren't perfectly metronomic, 3 flat at 3/4 was, by all accounts for this time, immaculate pacing, as all Bannister needed was a clean 59 closer to go under 4. Of course, he would do exactly this to accomplish his goal to become the first man ever to break 4 minutes in the mile. This single, very popular example showcased the value of how records could be broken if you had other people do some of the work for you. Even though pacemaking was briefly banned by the IAAF for a short period of time, this would eventually be lifted, and distance running in the following decades would occasionally see similar tactics used to break records. But it wouldn't be until the very governing body of athletics stepped in and decided to see what happens when you have, well, just about every race you can, paced to a T. The IAAF Golden League was a series of races in the 1990s and 2000s that would take place between July and September. The competition would be consistently world-class, there were sizable prize pools, and the meets were condensed to be as accessible as possible to the general public. Here was the other catch. In order to ensure consistently fast times and exciting action in the longer events, pacers were actually hired to keep the tempo hot, as even 800-meter races were now getting designated rabbits. The exact success of this idea is a bit hard to quantify, but it definitely accomplished the goal of guaranteeing races to at least attempt meeting national or world records as seen in a lot of the videos that exist today. By 2009, the IAAF Golden League had ended its circuit and was instead turned into what we now know as the Wanda Diamond League, virtually a more refined adaptation to fit the modern landscape of track and field. Pacemaking was still a very prevalent thing in these races, as it seemed like this was the way to house the longer events. Hire a few pacemakers. If they stick with them, great. If they don't, then the race will unfold into something else. Now, there certainly have been some pacemaking duties gone awry, or at the very least were inconsistent. So there was definitely a risk depending on the rabbit you hired of whether or not you'd get an evenly split opener. However, after decades and decades of other athletes pacing each other into world record territory, what if we added another factor into the equation? Initially, I had written down a number of timelines where a certain concept was introduced, but this rabbit hole went a bit further than I could have predicted. After scouring through a slew of patents, I was able to locate one from 1949 that proposes the idea of an automatic pacing system for a track. The description is a lot and gets a little confusing here and there, but the general gist was that a set of lights would go at a specific pace, and this could be used to teach runners how to train or race at a given tempo. But when would a concept like this actually be put into proper practice? In 1976, Jos Hermans from the Netherlands was scheduled to break his own 1-hour distance record that he set last year. Now, despite rabbits being very rare during this era still, it wouldn't be the most surprising thing ever to see one help out for perhaps the first 5, 10, or even 20 minutes of the race. But Hermans had a different idea. In order to ensure he consistently hit his paces, he placed one light at the start of the race and then another at the 200-meter mark. These lights were programmed to go off at specific intervals so that if he was able to see the lights go off during the race, he was behind pace. But if he didn't see them go off, then he was ahead of pace and had nothing to worry about. Initially, I had a hard time confirming this claim after scouring through newspaper archives from the Netherlands, but I was able to locate an article that does mention a usage of some sort of light system Hermans used to determine where he was during his record attempt. Soon enough, more and more patents started being filed left and right throughout the next few decades, and in the mid-2010s, some companies would show footage of a proof of concept for how it would work on an actual track. However, one company would manage to implement this idea so well that the IAAF had to get their hands on it. This is Wavelight. Pretty cool, right? Founded by the very man who crafted his own makeshift pacing system for his own world record attempt, would be one of the forefathers of this invention, and is the head of one of the most successful athlete management agencies, watching over the likes of some of the most successful distance athletes to ever grace the sport. On top of partnering with a known pacemaker in the Diamond League series, the two founded Wavelight Technologies, and would test the waters for the first time ever at the FPK Games in 2018, which was an IAAF-sanctioned event. While I couldn't locate any footage of Wavelights during the actual event, a video on Twitter does showcase them being used in 2018 during what seems to be a training session or a test run the day before competition. These lights nowadays are at just about any major race you will watch, aside from championship races, of course. From the 400 to the 10,000, you can expect to see these blue and green boys circling around the track at a specific pace, with one set of lights being for the pacemaker, and the other being the actual record pace. One of the first major meets they were used at was in Valencia during the 2020 pandemic, where Joshua Cheptegei and Letasembekide took on the men's 10,000 and women's 5,000 world records respectively. The result? Both records were shattered. That's some pretty quick success right there. And a study was even published in 2021 suggesting that these wavelights likely have ergogenic benefits and that world records in the future will in theory be easier to obtain. Of course, these nifty little LEDs don't come without a fair degree of criticism, but there's also some key components that many are missing that might enhance performance much more than some shiny lights. Over the decades of pacemaking culture, some track and field evangelists even today will argue against the notion of using rabbits in a race, let alone now having programmed lights to go at a precise speed. They'll normally assess that it takes away the natural competitive aspect of a race and that it artificially forces a specific type of competition that otherwise may have unfolded differently. To their defense, there is a bit of validity to these criticisms. After all, one of the charms of distance running is that there are varying degrees of strategy that come into play. You can pull up plenty of splits from previous Olympic or championship events, and these races, while borderline gimmicky at times, are pretty fascinating and memorable to watch. And it's not just because there are medals on the line either. On the other hand though, it is also pretty exciting to see athletes trying to run as fast as they possibly can, as record chasing is one of the most accessible and exciting ways to watch track and field. Perhaps a less substantiated argument is that these world record-breaking athletes would not be able to replicate these times without such metronomic pacing technology, thus watering down these accomplishments further. Canada Running Magazine notes that Lemaitre Girma's 3,000-meter steeplechase world record was essentially the direct result of the lights, stating that his pace fell off after 1,000 meters and that the lights pushed him through. While the latter is possibly true, albeit to a lesser extent, if we look at the official splits, they actually don't deviate that much at all, with his slowest split being at 2,400 meters, which is a fairly common sticking point before the faster closing lap. There is definitely a value to attribute to the lights providing more efficient pacemaking, which theoretically makes things easier, but given the recency of this technology, it's likely more data needs to show up before jumping to conclusions and exact numbers. As much as statistics like this and races like this can confirm the bias for wavelights doing some of the work, I do think we really undermine the true value of the more physiological game changers, and that's the implementation and consistent technological advancements of super shoes, the international adaptation of more efficient training methods that have revolutionized the way professionals train, combine that with new generational talent, and more. If anything, wavelight technology reflects an incredibly small component of faster racing, and to say they diminish records is a slippery slope. At that point, we'd have to eventually draw a line somewhere decades and decades back to where world records were fairly done. And trust me, we start getting into some weird territory depending on the decade we're talking about. There can be a line drawn somewhere, but even then, it's mostly speculative at the end of the day. Overall, pacers or rabbits will remain to be a key component in providing fast races and will certainly be necessary to attempt world records nowadays in the longer disciplines. With the slight aid of wavelight technology, the stability increase in pacing will obviously help, and while it shouldn't diminish a record entirely, its usage could be a bit more resourceful to prevent the Diamond League from being too one-dimensional. However, these lights can be looked at as a way to modernize the sport to newer audiences in what is in reality a pretty harmless addition. Record attempts are always amazing to witness, but subtly showing splits on screen really doesn't do that much to a complete newcomer, and wavelights bring that more visual stimulus to newer audiences, which make it, for what it's worth, a net positive for all parties involved. The fitness and training required to physically run these times is beyond impressive enough as well, and it can even be argued for some that wavelight technology is a bit superficial given the degree some of these records have fallen by recently anyways. It would be nice though to see more authentic distance races unfold, as the once a year or every 4 years for some a major championship race occurs. It can be an unhealthy habit to hypervalue certain races to the point where everything in between means almost nothing. Unless you're on the brink of breaking a world record, of course. But perhaps a change of pace wouldn't hurt, where rabbits and wavelight technology ceases to exist in at least some future Diamond League races. Now, will that happen? Probably not. But I guess we'll have to wait and see. Thank you to all my patrons for supporting the channel, and if you want to support the channel for more track and field content like this, come on over and become a patron. Drop a sub, and check out my other links below. I'll see you all in whatever video I upload next, and take care.